Welcome to The Cellar. Welcome to another episode of Horrible Fates. Before we dive into today's stories, I want to give a quick reminder. If you enjoy what I do here on the channel, please consider subscribing and please turn the notifications on so that you never miss a new upload. You can also find my merch store and social media links, as well as the link to my audio-only podcast version of my episodes, all below in the description box of every one of my videos. I'd also like to quickly share with you all my brother's YouTube channel, Journey with J Bear. He just began his YouTube journey, and if you'd be so kind as to check out his channel, I would greatly appreciate it. If you like the content he makes, please consider subscribing. It goes a long way in helping a small YouTuber on their journey. Now, with all that said, let's not waste any more time and dive into today's stories. Before we dive into story 1, I want to give a quick shout out to Jenny Stern. Jenny reached out to me on Facebook and recommended this first story we are going to dive into. So thank you, Jenny, for bringing it to my attention, and if any of you have a story that you think would be interesting for me to cover, please send me an email at TheCellarTrueCrime@gmail.com. It was June 14th, 2007 in Baytown, Texas. Baytown lies around 26 miles east of Houston, on the northern side of the Galveston Bay complex near the outlets of the San Jacinto River and Buffalo Bayou. Baytown's estimated population is listed as being around 84,000 total residents. Now, before we dive into the details of today's story, I wanted to touch on some further research I did. In that research, I discovered that Baytown has a crime rate of 42 per 1,000 residents. This means that Baytown has one of the highest crime rates in America compared to all communities of all sizes. Being that Baytown is 26 minutes from Houston, this seems to make sense, as Houston is the city in Texas with the highest crime rate. Houston has a wide range of violent and property crimes. The violent crime rate in Houston is 164% higher than the Texas average. To put this into context, residents have a 1 in 88 chance of becoming a victim of violent crime. Factors that contribute to Houston's high crime rate include high poverty and unemployment rates and a lack of well-paying jobs. To give even more context, Baytown had a total of 3,425 reported crimes in 2007. That number would rise steadily over the next few years, with it peaking at 4,335 in 2009. In the early morning hours of June 14, 2007, 15-year-old Bobby Davis was out with his younger brother Austin and 4 other friends. Those friends were 15-year-old Blake Barger and 3 girls, Laurel Moyers, age 12, her cousin Macy Moyers, age 14, and Colette Wyndham, age 14. Now, I don't know what the group was up to, but from what has been reported, it appears that they were up to just no good, as the group of friends would eventually get bored and seek out a vehicle to go joyriding in. They would soon find and steal a vehicle, and the group were on their way, cruising through the streets while most residents of Baytown were fast asleep. Shortly after stealing said vehicle, the pair would run into some bad luck, as the vehicle would break down on them, leaving them once again stranded and without a ride. It wasn't long before the group were once again going house to house looking for their next ride. They would eventually stumble upon a Jeep that was left open, and once again the group of friends would all climb in. Before long, they were back to cruising the quiet streets of Baytown. It was around 4 a.m. when the pair began driving down East Archer Road. I know for many of you, you're probably wondering, where are the parents in all of this? How is a group of 12, 14, and 15-year-olds just allowed to be out and about at 4 a.m. casually stealing people's cars? Well, it's a good question, and according to reports, the teens all snuck out of their houses that night. Bobby Davis was one of the oldest 2 boys in the group, and he was the one who seemingly took charge of driving the vehicle. He would soon begin his way down East Archer towards the 3000 block where a train crossing sat. Now, from what's been reported, it appears Bobby was aware of this train crossing, as the decision was soon made to speed up towards it in order to get some air under the vehicle as they hit the track. Now, This particular crossing had nothing, and I mean nothing, set up to warn people of a potential train being on the track. There were no crossing gates, there were no lights, there was simply nothing there to warn anyone. As the kids approached the track, the vehicle continued to gain speed. Just before reaching the crossing, Bobby would lock up the brakes of the vehicle, but it was already far too late. The Jeep Grand Cherokee would smash into one of the train's tank cars. The impact was violent, shearing the roof of the vehicle off. The roof would later be discovered on the other side of the tracks in a drainage ditch. With the roof gone, the vehicle, driven by speed and momentum, would become wedged under the tank car before it finally came to a rest. Following the collision, emergency personnel would be called to the scene, a scene that I'm certain many of them wished to never have to think about again. It would take some time, but all those in the vehicle would be pulled from the crash site. Miraculously, the driver, Bobby Davis, would survive. The person sitting next to him in the front passenger seat, Blake Barger, would also survive the ordeal. In the end, the rest were not so lucky. Bobby's younger brother Austin, as well as Laurel Moyers, her cousin Macy Moyers, and Colette Wyndham would all perish on that night. 4 young lives cut short well before they ever truly had a chance to live. There's not a ton of detail on what exactly happened to each person, but it was reported that all 4 suffered skull fractures as well as other head injuries. It was a horrible and tragic incident of the worst kind. So let's get into what exactly happened. Now, for some reason, a train had been sitting idle at that spot on the tracks for over half an hour. Add to it the fact that there was no warning of this train being there, and the simple negligence and inexperience of the young kids driving around in a stolen vehicle. It's all a recipe for disaster. Many were outraged and blaming the railroad for the entire ordeal. In my research, I did find that this particular railroad crossing was only 3 to 4 months away from being upgraded and given the safeguards it needed. In the end, Bobby Davis was charged with 4 counts of manslaughter. He would end up pleading no contest, and he would be sentenced to 8 years in juvenile custody. When he turns 18, he will either be transferred to a state prison or be put on parole. For some, this punishment was too much. For others, it was too little. In the end, Bobby will have to live the rest of his life with what happened. He lost 3 friends and his little brother in this tragic incident. At the same time, numerous families were destroyed when their children never came home on that fateful night in June of 2007. At the end of the day, I think there's plenty of blame to go around in this case. Should that railroad crossing have safety measures in place? Yes, of course. I think anyone could have collided with the train on that night. But what made this so devastating was the inexperienced driver and dangerous level of speed. Far too often, teenagers believe themselves to be invincible. Luckily, a lot of them get away with doing stupid things. Hell, I know I sure have. But it's plain and simply not always the case. Now, I don't have an in-depth look into each one of the teenagers' home lives, so it's hard to say too much, but I do have to question where the parents were. Not only should all of these teens been at home and in bed, but they sure as hell should not have been out stealing vehicles to take on joyrides. Not only did they rob one vehicle, they robbed a second one when the first one quit on them. Sadly, nothing can be done to bring back any of these poor lost souls. As always, I want to send my deepest condolences to all the friends and family members of those lost within this sad, sad story. I also hope, in shining a light on this story, that maybe, just maybe, another incident like this one can be prevented. This next story takes us to Broadstone. Broadstone is a suburb of Poole in Dorset, England. It is located around 3 miles or 5 kilometers from the Hamworthy railway station and 7 miles or 11 kilometers from the Bournemouth International Airport. Broadstone has a population of around 10,200 total residents. One of those residents, 60-year-old Elena Struthers Gardner, was in her home and making her way towards her kitchen. Elena was a former jockey who had suffered an injury while riding when she was 21 years old. This injury left Elena with mobility issues. She had suffered multiple fractures to her lumbar spine, which resulted in her having scoliosis. It was hard for Elena to get around, and the injuries only worsened with time, leaving her in constant pain. She would be prescribed fentanyl for a time, but she became highly addicted to the substance. Doctors worked with her to wean her off the drug, but the pain continued, and Elena would start self-medicating with alcohol to get through the tough days. Elena would slowly and painfully make her way into the kitchen. She would then proceed to grab a Mason-style drinking glass from one of her kitchen cabinets. She would fill the glass up and screw the lid on, placing a metal straw into the top of it, as straws were the easiest way for her to drink fluids. Now, not everyone may be aware of this, but over the course of the last 6 or so years, plastic straws have been banned throughout numerous U.S. states. California, Oregon, New York, Washington, D.C., and Colorado in particular. The UK would follow suit in October of 2020. The reason for the ban is that plastic straws have become a major contributor to plastic pollution worldwide. A lot of the straws that are used and thrown away tend to end up in the oceans and other waterways. There, they can harm marine life. Making matters worse, they also take up to 200 years to decompose. With the ban on plastic straws in place, people have begun using metal and solid plastic straws that can be washed and reused over and over. In Elena's case, she had a 10-inch metal straw that she would wash and reuse. With her beverage now in hand, Elena would begin making her way out of the kitchen and towards her den. Now, it's not clear on what exactly happened next, but as we said, Elena was very prone to falls. As she made her way to the den's entrance, she fell forward, drink still in hand, as her and the mason glass cup crashed to the ground. Somewhere around the house, Elena's wife Mandy was doing some chores. She never heard Elena fall, but eventually she would make her way towards the den of the house. That's where she would find Elena face down on the ground. Mandy described Elena as just lying there, making unusual gurgling sounds. She stated that she could see the glass jar was there near her, still intact, and with the straw sticking out of it. What she also noticed was that the 10-inch straw was also sticking out of her wife, Elena. Mandy would call emergency services immediately. While on the phone, she would notice that Elena had seemingly stopped breathing. She relayed this information to the dispatcher, who instructed her to try and roll Elena over onto her back. Mandy would do so, and that's when she saw the extent of what had happened. When Elena fell, she landed right onto the metal straw that was in her cup. The metal straw had zero give to it. Also, to add to the situation, the way the straw was in the cup, well, it locked the straw into position, meaning that the straw had almost no give to it in any direction. When Elena fell, she landed just right on that metal straw. The force of her body coming down on top of it forced the straw to go through her left eye. Being that the straw was 10 inches long, it buried deep into her eye socket and into her brain. Mandy was horrified by what she was experiencing, and soon emergency personnel arrived on scene. They would rush Elena to the Southampton General Hospital. At the hospital, Elena would fight for her life while doctors did all they could to save the woman. But in the end, doctors were unable to fix the damage that had been done to her brain. Elena Struthers Gardner would pass away the next day at 60 years of age. Elena's death would ultimately spark more debate on the use of rigid reusable straws. Elena's wife would state, "I just feel that in the hands of mobility-challenged people like Elena, or children, or even able-bodied people losing their footing, these straws are so very long and very strong." In my research, I found more instances of metal straws causing injury and death. In particular, I found plenty of instances where children suffered while using them. As you know, children are prone to being a bit clumsy and are at an increased risk of falling down. A lot of times kids fall and take their cups right with them to the ground. These straws can be very dangerous, as they basically become an item that can impale any individual. In telling Elena's story, I hope I can share enough information to make more people aware of the dangers of reusable straws. Whether you're someone prone to falling or dealing with any kind of mobility issue, or you have a child who likes to drink from straws, I hope in sharing this story we can create some more awareness and hopefully prevent another story like this one from ever taking place. As always, my deepest condolences go out to Elena as well as all her family and friends. This next story takes us to Fleet. Fleet is a village, civil parish, and electoral ward in the South Holland district of Lincolnshire, England. Fleet lies on the Delft Bank, 3 miles or 4.8 kilometers southeast from Holbeach. The population of Fleet is listed as being around 2,100 or so residents. One of those residents was 80-year-old Arthur Sexton, a retired printer. For those that don't know, a printer is someone who is responsible for producing a variety of materials, such as labels, newspapers, books, and posters. Printers use specialized skill to operate various different machines. The job often entails assessing print orders, selecting materials, and performing quality checks. Printers are often left to maintain the numerous machines they work on to ensure they're kept in tip-top working order. Arthur had long since retired and was enjoying a quiet life with his wife in their 3-bedroom home in the quaint village of Fleet. Arthur and his wife had 2 children in their lifetime and were now blessed with 1 grandchild that they adored. With some backstory out of the way, we'll now head to March 11, 2011. At around 4 p.m. that afternoon, Arthur proceeded to make his wife a cup of tea. His wife would sit down and relax with her drink while Arthur went outside to work on some things around the house. A few hours would pass by and Arthur's wife had not seen or heard from him. Knowing he couldn't have gotten far, she started looking around the property, but her search came up empty. It was getting dark at this point, so Arthur's wife walked next door to see if her neighbor could help search for Arthur. The police were immediately called while the neighbor grabbed a light and began searching around the couple's property. In the midst of searching, the neighbor came around the back side of the shed. That's when he saw Arthur's legs straight up in the air in what was a very unbelievable scenario. After Arthur had made his wife a cup of tea, he had left the house to go outside and do some work. Now, it's not clear exactly what he was doing, but at some point Arthur grabbed some stepladders and brought them over behind the shed. Arthur would proceed to climb up the flimsy stepladder, but he wasn't prepared for what would happen next, as the stepladder collapsed shut while he was standing on top of it. Arthur would fall forward headfirst towards the ground below, but Arthur would never hit the ground. Behind the shed, Arthur and his wife had a water butt. For those that don't know, a water butt is a large, outdoor container that collects rainwater from a rooftop and stores it for use. Water butts are a popular and inexpensive way to harvest rainwater and can be used for many purposes, like watering plants, gardens, or even just storing water to drink or bathe with. Arthur would go falling headfirst into this water butt, leaving his legs sticking out of the top. By the time his neighbor found him, Arthur was already gone. His neighbor attempted to remove him from the container, but it wasn't easy as Arthur had seemingly become wedged in very tight. Ultimately, Arthur would be freed from the water butt and an ambulance would show up, but there was nothing that could be done. When Arthur fell headfirst, he became wedged upside down, with his head fully submerged in the water that was being held by the container. Unable to free himself, Arthur would panic and struggle to get free, but within moments he would run out of air and drown. In what might be one of the most horrifying fates I have ever covered on the channel. I simply can't imagine falling and becoming stuck upside down and headfirst inside a container that's full of water. Arthur's final moments had to have been terrifying, to say the least. In the end, Arthur's death was ruled as an accidental drowning, his end coming in a way that no one could have ever seen coming. As always, I want to send my deepest condolences to all of Arthur's family and friends.
Take me home to the place I belong, West Virginia. Oh, mountain mama, Lord, take me home. Country roads.
Henry John Deutschendorf Jr., or better known under his stage name, John Denver, was born on December 31, 1943, in Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell is a city located in the southeastern section of New Mexico and has a population of around 48,000 current residents. For many, Roswell is best known as being the site of an alleged 1947 UFO crash. John Denver was born to parents Irma Louise and Captain Henry John Dutch Deutschendorf Sr. John's father Henry was a United States Army Air Force pilot that was stationed at the Roswell Army Airfield at the time he was born. His father was highly decorated and dedicated his life to the military. At home, you could say John Denver's life was tumultuous. His father was a very stern man, and it's said he wasn't one to show a lot of love towards his children. Due to his father's career in the military, the family moved rather frequently, which made it difficult for John to ever get settled and make friends within school. John would embrace music at a very young age. At only 11 years old, his grandmother would gift him an acoustic guitar. He would devote a lot of time into learning how to play, and by the time he graduated from high school, he began performing in local clubs. John Denver would attend college at Texas Tech University, where he was studying architecture. While there, he joined a folk music group, and his dream of being a musician only continued to grow. In 1963, he made the decision to drop out of college and move to California, fully committing himself to his musical dream. He would eventually join a band, but in 1969, John Denver decided to pursue a solo career. His first album, Rhymes and Reason, would be released in October of 1969 through RCA Records. The song, Leaving on a Jet Plane, would eventually make it to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. But the real success would come in 1971, when John released his second album, Poems, Prayers, and Promises. The song many of you know him for, Take Me Home, Country Road, was released as a single and eventually went all the way to number 2 on the Billboard charts. John Denver's career was in full swing throughout the 1970s. In the middle of this all, John and his estranged father would find common ground in flying. John's father would begin teaching him, and the time spent together would bring the pair closer than they ever had been. Jumping ahead, John Denver would get married for a second time in 1988. He married Australian actress Cassandra Delaney after 2 years of dating. The pair would settle into John's home in Aspen, Colorado, where they had a daughter together named Jessie Bell. This second marriage for John didn't go as he had hoped in the end. By 1991, the pair separated, and in 1993, they officially divorced. John was later quoted as saying, "In our short-lived marriage that ended in divorce, she succeeded in making a fool out of me across the entire valley." Following his failed marriage, John's life went through a pretty rocky patch. In 1993, Denver pled guilty to a drunk driving charge and was officially placed on probation. In August of 1994, he was once again charged with misdemeanor driving under the influence after crashing his Porsche into a tree in Aspen. He was still on probation at the time. John Denver would go to court in July of 1997. The charge he was facing was in regards to the second DUI incident. Ultimately, the trial would end in a hung jury. This now brings us to October of 1997. John Denver, at this point in his life, had released 11 albums that were certified platinum by the RIAA. This makes him one of the most successful recording artists of the 1970s. His successful music career helped him find success within film and television as well. When John wasn't playing music or acting, you could typically find him devoting time into flying. John Denver was a well-accomplished private pilot, with more than 2,700 hours on various single and multi-engine aircraft, with both an instrument and a Learjet rating. To put it simply, he had a lot of experience. On the afternoon of October 12, 1997, John Denver prepped for a flight in his new experimental light home-built aircraft, a Rutan Long Easy. John had recently purchased the aircraft as it was made by someone else from a kit. As far as this particular aircraft, John was not overly familiar with it. To give a little more context, the Rutan Model 61 Long-EZ is a tandem two-seater home-built aircraft designed by Burt Rutan's Rutan Aircraft Factory. The Long-EZ has a canard layout and a swept wing with wingtip rudders and a pusher engine and propeller. The tricycle landing gear has fixed main wheels with streamlined spats and a retractable nose wheel. At the time, in October of 1997, this particular plane had been responsible for 61 accidents, 19 of which were fatal. I also dove a little bit more into this particular aircraft and found that as of 2023, 114 Long-EZ aircrafts have been lost in accidents, with 44 total fatalities. John Denver would continue his flight prep at the Monterey Peninsula Airport. Soon he was ready to go and he would take off. The first thing he did was perform 3 consecutive touch-and-go landings. A touch-and-go landing is a flight training maneuver that allows pilots to practice landing and taking off techniques in a short amount of time. This helps pilots improve their aircraft control, judgment, and operational procedures. Following his 3rd touch-and-go, John Denver's plane took off into the sky, heading out over the Pacific Ocean. All appeared normal at first, until just moments after takeoff, John Denver's plane took a nosedive straight into the waters of Monterey Bay. The plane would break up instantly, leaving no chance that anyone could survive. Emergency services and rescue teams would report to the area as they looked to recover John and what was left of his plane. The large looming question being, what happened? Now, no one truly knows exactly what went down. There are theories, with some believing that John made the decision to take his own life on that fateful day. Could that be the case? It's possible. You can't know how John was feeling in that particular moment. But soon, the investigation would begin, and for some, answers would be found. First and foremost, John Denver was not legally licensed to fly that plane at the time of his death. In 1996, close to a year prior, the FAA had been informed that John Denver had failed to maintain sobriety. Following this revelation, they revoked his medical certification. Now, John Denver's body was recovered, piece by piece. Following a full autopsy, toxicology results would conclude that John was not under the influence at the time of his crash, so alcohol was not a factor. Ultimately, the National Transportation Safety Board would perform a full post-crash investigation. After countless interviews with those around John prior to the crash, they concluded that this was just a horrible, horrible accident. Prior to takeoff, John did not refuel his plane. Now, this wouldn't be a big deal, but prior to takeoff, John knew there was an issue with the plane's ability to switch fuel tanks during flight. Now, typically on this type of plane, the fuel tank selector valve handle would be located between the legs of the pilot, but the prior builder of the plane had placed it behind the pilot's left shoulder. To add to it all, the fuel gauge itself was also placed behind the pilot's seat, meaning whoever was flying the plane could not see the gauge. Prior to his final flight, John and his mechanic had discussed these issues. Not only was the fuel selector handle in a terrible place, but it was also resistant to being turned. In order for a pilot of the plane to switch between fuel tanks, they would have to turn their body a full 90 degrees. Doing this would cause the pilot of the plane to extend their right foot against the right rudder pedal to support oneself while turning around within the seat. Now, to solve the fuel gauge itself, the mechanic set up a mirror for John to use in order for him to get a glimpse of the gauge. The pair also tried to use vice grip pliers on the fuel selector handle, but according to the mechanic, it did not help. John Denver's plan was that he would use the autopilot in flight to hold the airplane level while he turned the fuel selector valve. He ultimately turned down an offer to refuel the aircraft. At the time, he stated that he would only be flying for about an hour and didn't believe it was necessary. In the end, many believe that if he simply had refueled, this tragedy would not have occurred. At the end of the day, no one else besides John Denver was in the cockpit on that fateful day. Was this tragic accident just that, an accident? Or could John have made the decision to leave this world while doing something he loved, flying? Some believe the latter, as some pilots don't believe that the strange valve placement would have been enough for John Denver to steer himself into a nosedive. George Rutan, the recreational pilot and father of the plane's designer, was quoted as saying, "To get the nose down like that, you have to be real purposeful." Some believe what happened to John Denver was darker than any tragic accident. While I think, based on the facts laid out, this all being a tragic accident is the most likely. From my research, these planes have resulted in numerous deaths over the years. Add to that the terrible placement of the fuel selector handle and the added difficulty of being able to even view the fuel gauge itself. Also add on John's unfamiliarity with this particular aircraft, and it all screams accident, at least in my book. So now, I ask all of you what you think. Was John Denver's death a tragic accident, or was it something else altogether? At the end of the day, John Denver's legacy continues to carry on long after his passing. His music touched many lives, and it will continue to do so. As always, I would like to send my deepest condolences to all of John's family, friends, and to the many fans of his timeless music. Paul William Walker IV was born on September 12, 1973, in Glendale, California. His mother, Cheryl Crabtree, was a fashion model, while his father, Paul William Walker III, was a sewer contractor and former two-time Golden Glove amateur boxer. Paul Walker was raised within the Mormon religion and had 4 younger siblings: Amy, Ashley, Caleb, and Cody. Mormons are a religious and cultural group related to Mormonism, the principal branch of the Latter-day Saint movement started by Joseph Smith in upstate New York during the 1820s. Paul spent most of his young life within the Sunland neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. He would go on to graduate from high school at Village Christian School in 1991. Following high school, Paul attended numerous community colleges, majoring in marine biology at the time. With his mother already being a model, Paul first began modeling himself at only 2 years old, first starring in a television commercial for Pampers diapers. Over the years, he would continue to pop up in commercials before beginning an acting career on television in 1984. His first role was in the teen anthology series CBS School Break Special. From there, he would continue to pop up in TV shows before landing his first leading role in 1987. He starred as a character named Jeremy Beatty in the sitcom Throb. Paul would go on to act in sitcoms throughout the 90s. He scored some B-film roles in the mid to late 80s, and as the 90s progressed, he acted in a handful of more films. 1998 to 2000 was when Paul started to make a name for himself, scoring supporting roles in films like Pleasantville in 1998, Varsity Blues in 1999, She's All That in 1999, and The Skulls in 2000. These roles were all good for his career, but 2001 would be the year he truly broke through, in the role that you all know him for, as Brian O'Connor in the very first Fast and Furious film. Following his breakout role, he went on to star in films like one of my personal favorites, Joyride, and he earned himself a spot in the Too Fast, Too Furious sequel. Paul would garner more roles over the years and was eventually approached to reprise his role as Brian O'Connor in Fast and Furious, the 4th film in the franchise. Brian had not returned for the 3rd film, Tokyo Drift, and was very reluctant to return to the character for a 3rd time. He ultimately would agree to return, and it's easy to say that it was a good decision, as Fast and Furious also brought back characters from the very first film, most notably Vin Diesel. The film would go on to become the highest-grossing film in the franchise at the time. Paul Walker would ultimately go on to star in 3 more films within the franchise, turning the Fast and Furious brand into an absolute cinematic juggernaut. In his personal life, Paul had a daughter named Meadow Rain Walker with his on and off again girlfriend Rebecca Soteros. Rebecca and Meadow both lived together in Hawaii for 13 years before Meadow made the decision to move to California and live with Paul. Paul and Vin Diesel had become extremely close friends over the years, to the point that Paul would ask Vin to be his daughter's godfather. In his free time, Paul trained jiu-jitsu, and after years of training had reached the status of brown belt. He was also a complete car enthusiast. Being involved in the Fast and Furious franchise was a bit of a dream for him, as he loved cars, and being involved in the films only further grew that love. Paul Walker owned Always Evolving, a Valencia high-end vehicle performance shop. The shop had their own AE Performance racing team, and Paul would end up competing in the Red Line Time Attack Racing Series. There, he drove a BMW E92 M3. Paul's love of cars was ever growing over the years. It's said that he amassed a pretty large collection of around 30 different vehicles. With all that said, we will now venture to November 30th, 2013. Paul Walker and Roger Rodas were attending a charity event called Winter Drive in Santa Clarita, California. Winter Drive was marketed as an automotive event and toy drive. Paul's charity, Reach Out Worldwide, was one of the main organizers of the event, which was being held for victims of Typhoon Haiyan. To give a little more context, Roger Rodas was a pro-AM racer. He was also the CEO of Paul's performance shop and a very close friend. At around 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, Walker and Rodas climbed into a red 2005 Porsche Carrera GT. Rodas was behind the wheel at the time, and soon the pair pulled out and left the event. Now, this particular car has a top speed of 330 kilometers an hour, or around 205 miles per hour. Based on performance testing, the car can go from 0 to 80 kilometers an hour or 0 to 50 miles per hour in around 2.61 seconds. There's a reason Sports Car International named the Carrera GT number 1 on its list of top sports cars of the 2000 and number 8 on its top sports cars of all time list. With Rodas behind the wheel, the pair sped away from the charity event. They would pull out and take an immediate right, following the road down a little ways before hanging another right. They would enter a straight stretch of road that was marked as being a 45 mile per hour or 72 kilometer an hour speed zone on Hercules Street in Valencia. Rodas would put his foot into the throttle a little more, taking the car to upwards of 80 to 93 miles per hour or around 130 to 150 kilometers per hour. The road ahead would bank slightly to the right. Rodas would keep his foot on the gas as the turn would straighten out. Coming off that turn, Rodas would lose control. Rodas would try to correct the car, but this was no racetrack. There wasn't much room for error on this street, and before Rodas could correct, the car struck a lamppost and 2 trees. The vehicle instantly burst into a ball of flames. Emergency officials would arrive on scene, but there was absolutely nothing they could do for either of the men. The car was absolutely destroyed, and both men were burned beyond recognition. Following a full investigation into what happened, it was determined that both men were knocked out during impact. They believe Rodas died instantly from multiple physical traumas suffered. Paul Walker is believed to have perished within seconds from the combined effects of the physical trauma he suffered and burns. Looking further into what went wrong, I found in my research that the 2005 Porsche Carrera GT can be difficult to drive due to its lack of electronic stability control. The car was also being driven with 2 9-year-old tires. It is likely that these tires had become overcured and hard over time. Now, these are all reasons why people believe Rodas lost control, but ultimately, the answer, at the end of the day, is excessive speed. Rodas was a racer, and it's clear he felt comfortable enough to drive the car at dangerously high speeds when he shouldn't have been. I'm not going to preach about excessive speeding, but at the end of the day, there's one silver lining, and that is that no one else was in the way of that car on that fateful day. Paul's death was a heartbreaking one to his family, friends, and the millions of fans he had garnered over the years. At the time, he was in the middle of filming Furious 7, and the production would end up going on hiatus. They ultimately were able to use Paul's brother, who looks a lot like him, to fill in some scenes and complete the film. If you've ever seen the end of Furious 7, it is a very touching and beautiful tribute to the late Paul Walker. For me, that's the day the Fast and Furious franchise came to an end. It simply hasn't been the same without Paul Walker. In the end, if there's anything we can learn from these stories, it's that life is fragile. So hold your loved ones close, never go to bed angry, and live each day to its fullest. As I always like to do here at the end, I want to send my condolences to not only Paul Walker's family and friends, but to Rodas' family and friends. A cryotherapy chamber is an enclosed space that exposes the body to extremely cold temperatures for a therapeutic purpose. In a cryotherapy chamber, you typically stand or sit, wearing a minimal amount of clothing, for around 2 to 5 minutes. The chamber then fills with air that has been rapidly cooled to temperatures between -100 degrees Celsius or -148 degrees Fahrenheit and -160 degrees Celsius or -256 degrees Fahrenheit. Cryotherapy is said to provide numerous health benefits, from pain relief and muscle recovery, short-term relief from arthritis pain, reduction of inflammation, energy boost, and speeding up overall recovery. There are many people that use cryotherapy chambers on the regular. However, research into its effectiveness has led to debate on whether or not it truly provides all the benefits it claims. Cryotherapy chambers started to rise in popularity in the 1980s and 1990s after being developed in the 1970s. The first cryotherapy device was invented by Japanese rheumatologist Toshima Yamaguchi in 1978. Yamaguchi wanted to tap into the potential of using cold temperatures to reduce his patients' inflammation and pain. With a little backstory out of the way, that now brings us to October 19th, 2018. A 24-year-old woman named Chelsea was getting herself ready for work. Chelsea was a night supervisor at the Rejuvenese Spa that is located in Henderson, Nevada. Henderson is a city in Clark County, Nevada, about 16 miles or 26 kilometers southeast of downtown Las Vegas. It is the second most populous city in all of Nevada, with an estimated population of around 320,000 residents. Chelsea grew up and spent most of her life living in Hawaii before she moved to Las Vegas with her boyfriend around 2015. Her boyfriend had just recently moved back to Hawaii to take a job, and Chelsea had planned to head back to Hawaii herself after another year or so at the spa. She wanted to gain more time and experience before opening up her own business. Chelsea would show up for a shift that afternoon, and from all reports, her day went about as normal as you would expect. At closing time, Chelsea would say goodbye to her coworkers as she proceeded to lock up and close down the spa. She was alone at the time, and after a long day, she decided she wanted to take advantage of the services her workplace provided. Chelsea made her way to the cryotherapy chamber. As she undressed and prepared to get in, she sent a text to her boyfriend, letting him know that she was going to use the cryo chamber before heading home. After the text was sent, Chelsea climbed in and began her treatment. The following morning, one of Chelsea's coworkers arrived to open up the spa. They parked their car and immediately noticed that Chelsea's vehicle was still in the parking lot. Upon opening up the front door and stepping inside, they found that Chelsea's personal belongings were also still there, like she had never left the night before. Chelsea's coworker would begin turning on the lights and started going around the spa to see if Chelsea was still there. When the coworker made it to the cryotherapy chamber, a horrifying discovery was made. Chelsea's lifeless, frozen body was still in the machine and had apparently been there all night. Emergency services were soon called, but it was clear right away that nothing could be done to save the young woman. An autopsy would be performed and toxicology results would come back. They showed that Chelsea had passed on due to asphyxiation. Upon investigation, it's believed that Chelsea lost consciousness while using the machine. The coroner stated, "Nitrogen, used to cool the chamber, displaced oxygen, sending levels from around 21% found in normal air to as low as 5%. Breathing air with this low level of oxygen can quickly result in unconsciousness and then death." There were no signs that Chelsea had even attempted to exit the cryo chamber. At the end of the day, no one knows exactly what went down or how long Chelsea had been inside the chamber prior to losing consciousness. Sadly, this is just a tragic story where a young woman lost her life unnecessarily. Now, I'm not one to point blame at a victim, but Chelsea did not follow safety precautions when using the cryo chamber, as you are always supposed to have another person in there with you to make sure nothing like this happens. My presumption in all of this is that this probably wasn't the first time that Chelsea had taken advantage of the free treatment after hours. She most likely had gotten very comfortable with using the cryo chamber and figured nothing bad had ever happened before, so why would anything bad happen now? Either way, a 24-year-old with so much life left ahead of her lost her life in such a terrible manner. I want to send my deepest condolences to all of Chelsea's friends and family. Now this next story takes us to Jingzhou, China. Jingzhou is a prefecture-level city that is located in the southern Hubei province of China. A prefecture-level city is an administrative division of the People's Republic of China, ranking it below a province and above a county within China's administrative structure. Jingzhou is located on the banks of the Yangtze River and has a residential population of over 5.2 million people. 31-year-old Zhang Lujuan was enjoying a day out at the AZG Mall with her 2-year-old son. Now, there currently isn't any readily available information about the AZG Mall, but what I was able to find is that the mall is listed as being around 50,000 square meters. If that's correct, then that would mean the mall is around 1/10 the size of the Mall of America, which is located in Minnesota. Zhang and her son spent a chunk of the day walking around and doing some shopping. At some point, the pair were walking around on the 6th floor of the mall. Zhang would make her way to a set of escalators in order to head up to the 7th floor, where the Angliang department store was located. Zhang, with her son in hand, stepped onto the escalator and was soon on her way up. From CCTV footage, her ride up the escalator was about as normal as could be, but Zhang wasn't prepared for what was going to greet her once she got to the top. Around 5 minutes before Zhang even stepped onto the escalator, mall staff members noticed an issue. They found that a panel had become loose at the top of the escalator. The staff were uncertain of what to do at the time, and from what's been reported, they weren't given any proper instructions. From what's been further reported, the company lacked any adequate training of staff on how to deal with an emergency escalator situation. If staff had been better trained, they would have known to shut down the escalator the moment they noticed something wasn't right. Back at the bottom of the escalator, Zhang didn't notice that anything was amiss at the top. It wasn't until Zhang made it around 3/4 of the way up that a staff member shouted down at her about the danger at hand. By then, it was too late. Now, there is footage of what occurred. I will play some of that for you now, but due to YouTube guidelines, I won't be able to play the entire thing without risking the video being demonetized. So let's go ahead and take a look at what took place. As Zhang made it to the top of the escalator, she lifted her son up in preparation to get off. Then, the already loose panel that staff had discovered would give way under her feet. Half of Zhang's body would vanish into the machine as she desperately tried to get her son to safety. She pushes her son forward as staff grab the boy and pull him away. Zhang's parental instincts kicked in, and in that moment, the only thing that mattered was her son's life. With her son now safe, the staff attempted to pull Zhang up, but within mere seconds, she disappeared into the escalator, being pulled down into the churning machinery below. Following the incident, rescue workers would soon arrive on scene. Getting Zhang out of the machine was no easy task, and it would take firefighters over 4 hours to cut into the escalator and find her. By the time they did, it was already too late. An investigation into the tragic incident would be done, and officials would state that maintenance had recently been done on the escalator, but it appears that the panel had not been screwed back into place properly upon completion. As the escalator continued to be used, the panel slowly worked itself free before collapsing. What's worse is that staff discovered the issue 5 minutes before Zhang was swallowed by the machine. If staff had done their job, Zhang would still be alive, and that 2-year-old boy would still have his mother. What's worse is that the boy watched as his mother was pulled into the escalator. At the end of the day, this tragedy could have and should have been prevented. Zhang, as a mother, did what she had to in order to get her son to safety, and her quick actions are nothing short of heroic. As always, I want to send my deepest condolences to all of Zhang's family and friends. Gary Hoy was a 39-year-old corporate and securities law specialist for the law firm of Holden Day Wilson in Toronto, Canada. Toronto is the most populous city in Canada, with a population of over 2.7 million residents. Toronto is the capital of the province of Ontario, and the city sits along Lake Ontario's northwestern shore. The city is a sprawling metropolis filled with soaring skyscrapers throughout. It was July 9th, 1993, and Gary Hoy was busy giving a tour of the Toronto Dominion Centre to a group of visiting law students. Now, according to sources, one part of Gary's routine with students was to show them the strength of the structure's window glass. Gary would demonstrate this by throwing the entire weight of his body into the windows overlooking the vast city. Being that it was something he had done numerous times prior, he had zero concern over how his demonstration would go. To give a little more context, Gary and the group of students were currently on the 24th floor of the building in a small conference room that was adjacent to a boardroom where a reception was being held for new students. Soon, Gary would begin his demonstration. He turned to the window glass and proceeded to throw the weight of his body up against it. He bounced off of it like so many times before, once again proving to everyone that the window glass would not break. Feeling very confident in the moment, Gary decided to demonstrate one more time to the group of law students. Soon, Gary was in motion, and once again his body would slam into the glass window on the 24th floor. Only this time, things did not go as Gary planned. Now, technically, the glass did not break. It held strong as Gary slammed into it, but the same cannot be said for the frame that held the window glass in place. As Gary slammed into the glass, the frame gave way, causing the entire window to go flying out from the side of the building. The momentum of Gary's body took him right along with it, as both plummeted 24 floors to the street below. To give a little more context, the 24th floor of a building like the one Gary was in is typically around 105 meters or 344 feet up from the ground below. As you can imagine, no one can survive a fall of this magnitude. The law students watching on could not believe what they had just seen take place, as many of them left the building that day traumatized to say the least. Ultimately, Gary Hoy's death would end up contributing to the closing of the Holden Day Wilson law firm only 3 years later in 1996. Gary Hoy's death would be talked about for a long time and was eventually featured in numerous television shows, from Mythbusters to 1,000 Ways to Die. In the end, I don't think this was the legacy that Gary Hoy had hoped to leave behind, but hopefully people can learn from what happened and not repeat the same tragic mistake. My deepest condolences go out to all of Gary Hoy's family and friends. Racing legend Cale Yarborough once famously said, "Driving a race car is like dancing with a chainsaw." For those that don't already know, NASCAR stands for National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing, and it's a sanctioning and operating company for auto racing within the United States. It's one of the world's top motorsports organizations and one of the biggest spectator sports leagues in the country. Stock car racing is a type of automobile racing that takes place on oval tracks and road courses. The cars used within stock car racing are based on the chassis of a standard production car. That has changed a bit over the years, as many of the cars are now designed and built specifically for racing. Stock car racing originated in the 1920s during Prohibition. Moonshiners, or those that produced and transported illegal alcohol, would modify their cars in order to evade the police. The cars themselves were very similar in appearance to their counterparts driven by everyday people, but they were modified for pure speed. Those that owned these modified vehicles would not only outrun the police, but they would begin racing each other for sheer excitement. NASCAR was founded back in 1947 in Daytona Beach, Florida. It would go on to become the top-level governing body for stock car racing in the U.S. To give a little bit more insight, professional stock car races are typically between 200 and 600 miles long. The cars themselves can reach speeds of over 200 miles per hour with their V8 engines, which produce close to 900 horsepower. For many, the 1970s are considered the golden era of stock car racing. This was due to a combination of factors, including the emergence of iconic drivers like Richard Petty and David Pearson, also significant advancements in car design and technology, as well as increased television exposure thanks to sponsors like the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, all contributed to the growing fandom of the sport. In 1975, one of NASCAR's most popular and prolific drivers would first suit up and take to the NASCAR Cup Series asphalt. That man was the legendary Dale Earnhardt. Ralph Dale Earnhardt was born on April 29, 1951, in the suburb of Kannapolis, North Carolina. Dale was the third child of Martha and Ralph Earnhardt. Dale's father was known as one of the best short-track drivers in all of North Carolina at the time. From the very beginning, Dale grew up with racing in his blood. In fact, at only 12 years of age, Dale would secretly drive his father's race car in one of his races. The competitors had no clue at the time that a 12-year-old was the one driving the car. Dale would race extremely well and even came close to victory over one of his father's fiercest competitors. Racing was all Dale ever wanted to do, and he would dedicate his life to the sport. In 1975, Dale suited up and raced in his first NASCAR Winston Cup event, the World 600, at Charlotte Motor Speedway. Dale would compete in a handful of races over the next few years, but his career really kicked off in 1979 when he raced full-time and won Rookie of the Year honors. Now, I could probably do an hour-long video diving into Dale, his life, and all of his accomplishments, but this video is not a documentary on Dale Earnhardt. At the end of the day, Dale Earnhardt would win his first Cup championship in his sophomore season. From there, he never looked back. He would go on to race from 1975 until 2001. In that time, he won 76 Winston Cup races, and he also won 24 non-points exhibition events. This would bring his overall Winston Cup win total to 100, making him one of only 4 drivers in NASCAR history to do so. To understand his greatness even further, he is the only driver in NASCAR history to score at least one win in 4 different and consecutive decades, scoring his first career win in 1979, 38 wins in the 1980s, 35 wins in the 1990s, and scoring his final 2 career wins in 2000. He also won 7 Winston Cup championships, a record that he shares with 2 other legends of the sport, Richard Petty and Jimmy Johnson. For those that loved stock car racing, Dale Earnhardt for many decades was the face of the sport. He most notably drove the number 3 Chevrolet for Richard Childress Racing, and his aggressive driving style earned him the nicknames the Intimidator and the Man in Black. To put it simply, Dale was an aggressive driver who had no fear out on that racetrack. In 1999, Dale's son, Dale Earnhardt Jr., would join the NASCAR Cup Series. Both father and son would go on to compete with one another for a couple of years, which now brings us to February 18th, 2001. The Super Bowl of stock car racing, the 2001 Daytona 500, the 43rd running of the event, was the first race of the 2001 NASCAR Winston Cup Series schedule. The race consisted of 200 laps and 500 miles on the 2.5-mile, 4-kilometer asphalt tri-oval. Daytona Speedway has a reputation. The massive track was known for speed over the years. As cars became faster and aerodynamics improved, the speeds at the track hit an all-time high in 1987 when Bill Elliott was recorded at 212 miles per hour or 341 kilometers per hour. Following 1987, NASCAR implemented restrictor plates at both Daytona and Talladega superspeedways. For those that don't know, a restrictor plate is a device that limits the amount of air that can enter an engine, reducing its power, speed, and horsepower. To give you a full understanding, in 1987, Bill Elliott hit 212 miles per hour or 341 kilometers per hour, while at the 2001 Daytona 500, Bill Elliott qualified at 183 miles per hour or 294 kilometers per hour. The restrictor plates reduced the speed, but also changed the style of racing, as the 43 cars racing on the track would remain bunched together, drafting off one another. This led to extremely exciting racing for the fans, but for the drivers, it was nerve-wracking to say the least. One slip-up by any driver could lead to what fans started calling the big one. As I stated, Daytona had a reputation, as Daytona International Speedway has had 14 driver casualties in NASCAR, the most by far of any track. On February 18, 2001, the Daytona 500 would kick off, and on lap 173, the big one would occur, as Ward Burton made contact with Robbie Gordon, sending Tony Stewart flipping twice down the backstretch.
Sideways. Here's the why. Here's the 4 got into the back of Ward Burton, I believe. And then Burton's 22 got into Stewart. And everybody scrambles. That car is taking a whale of a ride, that 20 car is.
That's Ward Burton right there.
I saw a puff of tire smoke, and then everything let loose.
I think that's what started. Somebody got back of Ward Burton off turn 2.
The 4 car got into the back of Ward Burton, turned him into the 20 car, and God help all of them because there's no place to go.
18 of the 43 cars in total were involved in this massive accident. Luckily, everyone involved would be okay. Soon, the track would be cleaned up, and the race would continue on. As the final laps approached, no one knew what was about to happen.
And look at them go.
Here they come, gang. I told you, you think these guys will settle down, take it easy, say, hey, everybody's going to get a good finish? No way. They're going to race their hearts out.
Come on, get him in the fold. Get him in
The 3 cars out.
Oh! Big trouble. Big wreck behind them.
Man, you got it. You got it. You got it.
You got it.
Michael Walsh wins.
I just hope Dale was okay. I guess he's all right, isn't he?
You okay? You okay?
As you can see in the video, Earnhardt was driving his famous black No. 3 Chevrolet when he collided with Ken Schrader after making small contact with Sterling Marlin. The black No. 3 would end up hitting the outside wall head-on. Earnhardt, known for his aggressive driving style, had been blocking both Schrader on the outside and Marlin on the inside at the time of the accident. After hitting the wall, his car would slide down the banking and into the infield grass inside of Turn 4. As this all took place, just in front of the accident, Earnhardt's driver Michael Waltrip went on to win the race, while Earnhardt's son Dale Jr. would end up finishing second behind his teammate. Michael and Dale Jr. were excited with how the race had finished, but that excitement would soon be overshadowed. As medical and safety crews arrived at Dale Earnhardt's wrecked car, it became quickly apparent that Dale wasn't well. He would have to be cut out of the car, and Dale was then rushed to the Halifax Medical Center. Surrounded by his wife Teresa, his team owner and closest friend Richard Childress, and his son Dale Earnhardt Jr., Dale Sr. was pronounced dead at 5:16 p.m. February 21st of 2001 would later go on to be called Black Sunday, the day the sport lost their biggest living legend. Ultimately, Dale had succumbed to a basilar skull fracture. A basilar skull fracture is a break of a bone in the base of the skull. Symptoms may include bruising behind the ears, bruising around the eyes, or blood behind the eardrum. A cerebrospinal fluid leak also occurs in about 20% of cases and may result in fluid leaking from the nose or the ear. It is believed that Dale Earnhardt's car was traveling at a speed of 155 to 160 miles per hour, or around 257 kilometers per hour, when he hit the wall head-on. This sudden impact would have snapped his neck and head forward into the steering wheel rather violently. Medical professionals believe he passed on instantly. Dale Earnhardt was only 49 when he passed, but his death would not be in vain, as following his horrible fate, NASCAR finally took safety seriously within the sport. They would go on to develop safer barriers that absorb the impact of cars hitting the walls. They also implemented the Hans head and neck device, carbon fiber seats, seat belts, new roll cages, and a 6-point harness system, as well as many other changes. Prior to Dale's death, 91 NASCAR drivers had lost their lives within races. Dale would become number 92, but since 2001, no other drivers have died as a result of the intense dedication into safety. In 2010, Dale would be a part of the first class inducted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame. He had a massive impact on so many within the sport, and in some ways, he had an even bigger impact as a result of his tragic loss of life. Dale left behind a legacy of being a driver you never wanted to tangle with out on the track, and fans loved him for his aggressive style and attitude. His legacy will always live on within the sport. It's a shame he had to pass on in order for NASCAR to start taking safety seriously. But as a result of what occurred, so many future drivers will now be able to go home to their families. As always, my deepest condolences go out to all the family, friends, and fans of the late great Dale Earnhardt. In closing, I thought it was only fitting to go out on a Dale Earnhardt quote: "You can't let one bad moment spoil a bunch of good ones." Thank you all for tuning in to another episode. If you enjoy the content, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps the channel continue to grow. It's also very important that you hit the notification bell and turn on notifications, as you may not be alerted of my uploads if you don't do so. In the description box below, you'll also find a link to my merch store and a link to the Cellar Dwellers membership tier for the channel. If you're interested, please take a moment to check those things out. And if you'd like to submit your own scary story or a story recommendation, you can do so using the email I have linked in the description box below. As always, I do all the research, writing, recording, and editing for the channel myself, so anything that you do to support the channel is greatly appreciated. Until next time, I will see you all again as we head back into the cellar.